Yeah, really excited to be here. Okay. And I wanted to thank Cornelia and Adam to invite me here. Adam introduced me as like a colleague at Northumbria University in Newcastle, but it's also like as a fellow trade union, like a comrade maybe. And I think that's important because like that's how you get to know my work. So the reason why like Adam learned about my book and the stuff that I will be presenting today is because like after one of the strikes we had, I think like it was a couple of years ago, we had a teach out in a pub and I delivered a presentation that was like along the lines of this one, like a bit more focused on the more contemporary stuff like that I discussed in my book. And that was the occasion for Adam to get to know my work, and probably that's like where kind of this invitation fits. I think the story is important because like when we talk about resistance, I don't know, I assume, or I like to think, and probably I'm wrong, but we don't do it just like for an academic purpose. We don't do it just like theoretically. It's not just a theoretical interest. It's what I would say like an ethical or political instinct of some sort. And I think like that's what I want to try to connect today with the presentation. So yeah, I'll be talking about Étienne de la Boétie, which is like probably a minor French, we could say political thinker, probably was not a political thinker, but like we're gonna use like one of his texts, like his most famous text, to discuss what resistance is and what resistance could be, or what we can make of resistance in terms of like creating a whole politics of resistance. What we will do today is to change a little bit the understanding of resistance, trying to expand it. Yesterday, Caroline started with a definition of resistance that is probably the most common way we understand resistance, which is something, as she said, like something opposed to power. And that's definitely like what we start with, like what we work on, with in terms of like what a basic definition of resistance can be. I will try to challenge that and I will try to expand it to make it a little bit wider than that. And by the end, what I will be trying to do is like to reverse it and to turn it upside down. So it's not that resistance is opposed to power, but it's power that is opposed to resistance. And power as opposed to forms of what we call resistance in here, but like forms of life or forms of living that are more cooperative, more anti-hierarchical. And this is again like something that I wanted to say yesterday with Caroline when she says like, oh, hierarchy is not so bad because like if hierarchy is better, anti-hierarchy is better than hierarchy.
Sorry, Marco, can I just interrupt? This morning I just picked up a cup of coffee and I just looked out the window and went, hierarchies are not bad.
Did your coffee went bad after that? I was struggling with that because like I was reflecting on it. I think like it was before my coffee, but I was thinking like, no, I totally disagree. It's very formalistic and logical to think of in that way, and I see where she's coming from. But I'm definitely against the hierarchies, and I think like that's what I will try to show today with this presentation. The title is Before After the Misfortune, and we'll play a little bit with that after, because like it can have different meanings, like as we will probably see later. This is an image that, if you're familiar with modern political philosophy, is very famous. Is like the frontispiece of Hobbes' Leviathan, and the image is really indicative of what kind of political philosophy they were thinking about, like in the modern times, and is at the basis of European modern political thoughts, which is basically like, as you can see there, I have a point as well. Yeah. As you can see, that this is the body of the sovereign, like that it sort of makes the head of the state, and the head and the state is made out of like the bodies of the citizens, of all of us. Like so, we all participate to that. So it creates this like intimate relationship in which like we're not just subject to power, but we participate to power, even as subject. As subjected and subjects, like that's in French works really well, but like I'm not going to say that in French. The reason why I'm going to use this, even if I'm not going to talk about Hobbes, is because like it was used also in a French edition of La Boétie work in '76, and I found it really interesting because like this idea of the from Hobbes of the state of nature and the civil state, we try to recreate it here today with La Boétie. I realize that might be something that I'm really familiar with, like, but not necessarily everybody is. The idea of these contrarians, they were called the modern early modern political philosophy, European political philosophy. They had this idea that like we need the state, we need political power, because otherwise, like, we live in a state of nature, and a state of nature is chaos, according to Hobbes. It's a state where everybody hates each other, radically selfish, and so you need to be careful, and you need to. It's exhausting life because, like, it's a war of everyone against everyone. So we need to move away from the state of nature and get into the Leviathan. So we'll challenge that using Etienne de la Boétie, French, 1530, born in Sarlat, died really young, like 33, but in 33 years, like did so many things, like including his most famous work that we'll discuss today, which is the discourse on voluntary servitude. There have been like several different translations. Sometimes it's translated as the against one, against the tyrant. This discourse was probably written in 1553, so he was still really young, but it was never published. He never published it, and it was circulated sort of clandestinely, like it was circulating among people that were interested in that, and then it gets appropriated by at the time by the Huguenots resistance. He was not like part of that at all, so it was like a little bit like almost stolen book. Like, and this is an important detail because I think like this is like the beginning where we try to what we're trying to do is to dissociate his work from his life and his more general thought. We'll see later how. Somebody claims that like he wouldn't have agreed later on with what he wrote when he was younger, which is an experience that like we might all have to some extent. We write something, we read it like 5 years later, and so like, oh, did I write that? But we all seems to want consistency when we look at other authors. Like we want to have like a story that makes sense, and it's like they've always been on the same idea. Probably was not the case. We don't really care. I think like the text is interesting in itself, and we're gonna use it. The main thesis of the text, and that gives the idea of the title of this voluntary servitude, is that power is built upon a voluntary submission to power. There is nothing that really forces us to submit to power. There is to some extent, some force, some violence, but the real aspect that keeps us subject to power is our education habit, according to La Boétie. So we are so used to it that we just leave it there. We don't challenge it. We don't take it down. And this is the main idea, which has like the radical political consequence of like, if you just withdraw your consent or you withdraw your servitude, power collapses. So this is like almost like very simplistic way of looking at power and a very simplistic way of looking at resistance and power relations. But it's also, I think, like a way of moving away from that assumption that power is inevitable. I think, like yesterday with Caroline lecture, we had quite a lot of that. Like she was challenging these three narratives where ecocide or the climate change catastrophe was inevitable and unstoppable. And I think like we live with a lot of this inevitability of power, of capitalism, of climate catastrophe. We always think like that's going to be there. And this like is a refreshing way of reminding ourselves that maybe that's not the case. Now, there are conflicting origins of why he wrote this, and I'm not here to establish what is the correct origin, but I think like the idea of origin helps us connecting a little bit. So this is a little bit of an experiment. I wanted to ask you to close your eyes, but you don't have to close your eyes. And try to think like why you got interested in resistance. Why did you think like that resistance was a topic that like could be of your academic interest, but also beyond that? Maybe there was an event in your life. Maybe there was a moment in your life in which you realized that's where my side is. We're like that. This is the side I'm on. Yeah, I'll share mine in the meantime. My dad, like, is a very serious person, very rational, not political at all. Very cold. We don't have like a great relationship. But when I was like a kid, I remember like that he was. I had this image of like I was probably 5 or 6, and I was watching him from the balcony. And he was moving a garbage bin to create a barricade and block the street, and together with other people, not on his own. It was like an impromptu, spontaneous protest against the lack of collection of the garbage in the area. It was summer, so it was really smelly. And they did this like, that was like really radical as an action, like my dad never did anything else. But I think like to some extent he created that connection to me. I was like, oh wow, that's something you can do. And I think like it stayed with me, and I think like my commitment to resistance doesn't stop like in being interested in this theory, but yeah, I try to do what I can, where I can, forms of activism or forms of like struggles where I manage. So the reason why I wanted to look at origins is because, like, in the case of this book of the discourse de la of this voluntary servitude, there are two main stories about the origin, and I think they are important to trace them because, like, they help us to understand different ways of understanding resistance and different ways of understanding, like, what we can do with resistance. So the widely accepted story is that La Boétie observed like a tax revolt of 1548, where people were protesting against the rise of a tax on salt, and they assaulted the director general, they killed him, and the repression to that was quite brutal, with 140 people getting killed. And this was like this account was produced by a historian that says like La Boétie observed these events, and he was really shocked by the repression, and that's why he decided to write this book, this discourse. This fits like a particular narrative, and especially like the English appropriations of it. With Adam, like he asked me, like, did you find an English translation that is not coming from these libertarian, right-wing, anarcho-capitalist guys? No, there isn't. There isn't an English translation for that. I put some of the most cringy covers of the books that they produce in English. That was like absolutely horrendous with the kid, but also like those people jumping. Even that one, it looks like a sort of self-help book, you know, like result no longer to be slaves and you're free. Amazing. The main translation comes from Kurtz from 1940s, but it got published in 1975 with an introduction by Maury Rothbard, and was printed by the Ludwig von Mises Institute. This is basically a think tank of anarcho-capitalists. Anarcho-capitalists like are those they basically hate the state, but the reason why they hate the state is just because they don't want to pay taxes. And all they want like is everything ruled through the market. Elon Musk would be one of those, for instance. Like just to give you an idea, Peter Thiel, all these kind of like tech bros, like they love these ideas of let's get rid of the state so we can just like get along with the market. Another one that published the book, it was like Ralph Miles in 1974, translation The Will to Bondage. The preface was by a certain J.J. Martin, individualist, anarchist, but like also in this tradition of anarcho-capitalists, also Holocaust denier, just to give you an idea of the constellation. Interestingly enough, like in 1976, there is like the French edition that instead is the one that we'll look at later on, which is like more an anarchist version. So you have like these very two different traditions of, in English, it seems to be appropriated by right-wing free marketeers, and in French instead, like is a sort of staple of radical politics. Now, to some extent, like I think that like maybe the English appropriation sort of like aligns with what I call the domestication of the discourse by Montaigne. Montaigne was like his best friend. He wrote his famous essay on friendship is actually dedicated to Etienne de la Boétie. And he was planning to publish the discourse on the voluntary servitude in the essays. It doesn't, because in the meantime, the text gets sort of stolen and published and circulated by the Huguenots that are not exactly Montaigne's friends. And this creates like a sort of almost rejection from Montaigne, probably for his own political purposes, like from defending himself. He didn't want to be associated with that. He didn't want to be associated with this text, probably for political reasons, for not getting into troubles himself. But like what he does is basically trying to dissociate de la Boétie as well from the book. It says like, oh, he was really young. This was something like that he wrote just because like he was childish kind of ideas. He didn't really think those ideas. He didn't have the chance to revise this idea before publishing them. He's actually really loyal to the state because like if he, in the introduction to the essay on friendship in the English version, it says like, he was so loyal to me as a friend that must be also loyal to the state, which is a very strange kind of way of like associating the two things. But yeah, and then he also has like a right after that, there is the essay on of cannibals, which introduced this idea of this encounter with this is like a fictional encounter. Based on the reports from these travelers, these European travelers that arrive in South America specifically, and they encounter these people that Montaigne describes as cannibals. Now we're going to use them as the second origin, but we'll try to give more credit to that political potential, which probably Montaigne doesn't do justice to that. So the new context that we're trying to explore in terms of like the other possible origin of the text is the It's hard to discover because, like, when I was at school, that was like called the discovery of the Americas, like the discovery of something that was already existing. It's not a discovery, obviously, and we have like a. I mean, like I prefer to think of it as an encounter from this perspective. Obviously, like it was like a violent mission of colonial and imperialist, like conquest. So. But like what I think it's in there, it's also like a different level, maybe like a low level or marginal level of just encounters. And especially encounters of travelers that probably didn't have the same colonial attitude, and they're genuinely surprised and curious by this meeting these very different people that don't have European customs and European habits. And I like to think that that's what inspired La Boétie. There is this passage in, it's very brief, but the reference I think is really powerful. So what he's trying to say, like in the discourse of voluntary servitude, is that like we are so used and we are so trained and educated into submitting to power that we have forgotten, and I think like forgetting is like a key in here, forgotten any other way of living. But he says, like, imagine like, if we think of people that are completely new. And by completely new, I follow the interpretation of anthropologist Pierre Clastres that I'll introduce in a second. But this idea of the completely new is this like encounter with something that like is unimaginable, or it was unimaginable. And those people that like don't have even the notion of freedom and slavery, or freedom and servitude, and he says like, what would they choose? They obviously would choose like freedom. They would never submit to power. Now, this is the interpretation of Pierre Clastres, like anthropologist, anarchist anthropologist, I would say, and in writes in the introduction. Oh yeah, I forgot to say, but like the quotes are in the handouts. That's if it's easier to navigate. I would never remember where I put them, but thank you. And then Clastres like emphasize a lot this encounter, this origin, this different origin of the discourse on the voluntary servitude. And he says like that for La Boétie, we're talking about like a misfortune, a tragic accident. Power didn't have to happen. Power is not natural. There was a state of nature, basically, where things were completely different. And there was no form of power whatsoever. And then there is like the misfortune, this tragic accident, this unnecessary bad luck, this event that introduces power. Now, this is also like an idea that we find in Rousseau on the discourse on inequality, on the origin of inequality. But like in Rousseau, it's a fictional kind of thing. Here, instead, it's presented almost as a historical possibility. It did exist. It was like that. It used to be like that. And then something happened. Something bad happened. And I think like this is like a really interesting way of placing a different way of origin. So it's not a response to attacks, revolt, and repression, but it's like the surprise or the curiosity of an encounter with a very different way of living. A way of living that, like in a way, he ascribes to nature. And he has like these two aspects that he relates to nature. One is this long quote that is also in the handout about animals. And this is childish, and I think like it's borderline stupid, like what he says about like what animals do. But I think like it's very powerful. He says like a fish, when it gets captured, as soon as it's taken out of the water, it dies. And dies not for biological reasons, but just because it doesn't want to be captured. It doesn't want to be renouncing to their freedom. I think like it's absolutely fantastic, like as a way of giving this powerful image of like a refusal to submit, refusal to servitude. And then it talks about an elephant. I've been wondering, like, why did he know about elephants? And apparently there were elephants in Europe in even in the 13th centuries, like imported, obviously, like transported for kings. And but anyway, like he has this story, which I don't even know, like if it's true. But like when an elephant is about to get captured, he destroys his tasks. So that's like he offers the task to the predator, and it's just like, take them, like so you're done with what you need from me, but don't capture me or don't kill me. I'm not sure, like, if elephants do that. Probably not. Otherwise, like, would be like very clever. It's almost I avoid the joke, but this is just like a way to see how rooted into our nature, I would say, is to refuse servitude. And then he goes to this quote about like what we lost or what we've forgotten, and it's also really powerful and really interesting because like it talks about like differences between humans in terms of like force, strength, intelligence, and this is like a traditional topic for political philosophy. Even Aristotle like has got like these people that like are naturally inclined to obey, to be slaves, and people that are naturally inclined to be masters. So there is always like in political philosophy this attempt of what to make of natural differences. Some are taller, some are smaller, some are stronger, some are weaker. What do we do with these political differences, with these natural differences at the level of politics, at the level of organizing political power? And what the La Boétie proposes like is basically like a picture of mutual aid and solidarity. So nature makes us all different to give us the occasion to help each other, which is like a radically cooperative and solidaristic and collective way of living. Nature has revealed in every possible manner her intention, not so much to associate us as to make us one organic whole. There can be no further doubt that we are all naturally free in so much as we are all comrades. There are two very interesting things that happen here. First is that the English translation of this right-wing anarcho-capitalist used comrades. And I was like, wow. The French would be compagnon, but actually, like, interestingly enough, when the anarchists republished the paper, they used another French version that didn't have the compagnon, but had we are all equal, which is much softer in a way. I mean, like, we are all comrades, it's definitely stronger. But what I think like is very interesting here is that it subordinates freedom to comradeship. So there is like this level of collective life and cooperative life that comes first. So it's a way of living that is more important than our freedom. Our freedom is just a consequence of the fact that like we are all naturally prescribed almost, or inclined to cooperate and help each other. And I think like this give us like a different sense of resistance. It starts giving us a different sense of resistance. So before power, before the tragic accident of power, before the misfortune of power, we have this historical way of living that is based on the natural companionship, on this natural comradeship. And that's what gives us like our freedom. So what I try to do with La Boétie is to extract three trajectories. The first one is this trajectory of the historical primacy of a different way of living. So if power is just a misfortune, just an accident that happened at some point historically, even we cannot place it like when in history it happened, it also means that it can be overcome. And this historical primacy, obviously, like is taken from this intuition that comes from the encounter with these new people. But then, at the same time, like slightly later on, I refer to Silvia Federici's book Caliban and the Witch, which is like a really powerful historical account of how witch hunt and the enclosures are these two phenomena that come together and come in alignment, and that are the primitive accumulation that basically decrease the start of capitalism. And it's interesting because, like, to some extent, it's like La Boétie is sort of fantasizing or exoticizing like this historical moment that is prior to power, and instead, like Federici give us like the historical account of how it got destroyed, how the misfortune happened in a way. She said capitalism was not the only possible response to the crisis of feudal power. Throughout Europe, vast communalistic social movements and rebellions against feudalism offered the promise of a new egalitarian society built on social equality and cooperation. And this gets destroyed both through the enclosures and through witch hunts. So this is like a historical accounts of like making this primacy of communal living or solidarity living or more real in a way. The second trajectory, and I think like that's where I want to move away from that initial understanding of resistance as just opposed to power, is to try to introduce like a wider spectrum of resistance that goes from the traditional accounts of resistance, which is like a reactive response to forms of power. So like the tax revolt in La Boétie, in the possible origin of La Boétie's work, to at the other extreme of the spectrum of resistance, which I'm trying to propose here, is this idea of like an affirmative idea of resistance. Affirmative in the sense like of an autonomous way of thinking resistance without power, which sounds like absolutely unfounded to some extent, but we do think of power all the time without resistance. We do give power the possibility of being thought autonomously, and we never do the opposite for resistance. So what if like we try to turn things upside down and think of power as a reaction to resistance and not resistance as a reaction to power? The other trajectory is something that I haven't really explored completely, but it's a way of like trying to use these ideas as a sort of a compass for navigating what is a good resistance from what is a bad resistance. I think resistance, especially like in this, I mean, probably it's always been the case, but like in the last couple of decades, like has been a kind of reappropriated by by the far right, by the MAGA movement. I mean, like they always have this idea of like, it's the deep state, we are against the deep state. And it's like, who's the deep state? Like you are the deep state, aren't you? But, so in a way, like they use these aesthetics of resistance for justifying like basically replacing that power with another power. So we want to be in charge, not them. And instead, like, what if we think of resistance, or a good resistance, as the one that destroys power altogether and doesn't try to create a different power, or doesn't try to establish a different power? I mean, in the example, for instance, like when we were using like, the example of the English translations, we had this example of the anarcho-capitalists that basically, yes, they want to get rid of the state, but what they want is to maintain the inequality of the free market, or the power of those who dominate the market, of the wealthier. So it's just like a different form of power. It's not like the abolition of power as such. Now, from those three trajectories, I think like we need to go back to the image of the Leviathan to understand, okay, what do we do? So we have after the misfortune, and this is like after the misfortune, the tragic accident of power happening. So what do we do with that, and what can we do in terms of resistance? And I use Michel Foucault. Actually, Michel Foucault was the original inspiration for all of this, and then from Foucault I got to La Boétie. And Foucault has this quote in an interview from 1982. I think it was Deleuze says that like the most interesting things about Foucault come from the interviews, from the things he didn't publish. The things he published, like we remember Foucault for the Panopticon, for these like really dark images of disciplinary power, where there is always power, where there is the resistance, there is power, but what we read is like power is everywhere. Like we don't read resistance is everywhere, which is a strange interpretation of Foucault. But in the interviews, like it goes a little bit beyond that, and it tries to be like probably a little bit opening up creative and expansive trajectories. And he has this like quote that is like, you have to use power relations to refer to the situation where you're not doing what you want. I found this part of the quote interesting, to some extent, like makes sense. So like obviously like power doesn't need to oblige you to do things you like, in a way. So power intervenes when there are things you don't want to do. Or waking up early to go to work, that's definitely something you don't want to do. So power obliges you to do that. Like there are disciplinary forces in place to make sure that you go to work and you're at work on time. But then you know also that somebody loves to go to work. I don't know why, but like there are a lot of people that actually like love to go to work and love to submit to power to some extent, which is the idea of the voluntary servitude, which is also this idea that like we are so used to power, we are so trained to be obeying power, that how do we know what we want and what we don't want? So I found that part like a little bit problematic, especially in relation to well, I call broken imagination, but I think probably broken is not the right word. But like, we do have an issue with our imagination. We do have an issue in thinking like beyond the existent or beyond the state of things as we know them. And this was like from Il Manifesto, which is an Italian newspaper. And it says like, what do we resist today? I don't know, I need to check my agenda. And it's because like we do face so many things. Like yesterday I was like so intrigued by the fact that Caroline was so focused on these environmental issues, on climate catastrophe, climate change. And to some extent that's something that I don't know to how much I can connect, if I'm honest. Like I think like I sort of like put it back together into like I'm an anti-capitalist. That's what makes me also like worried about the climate crisis. But I think like there is so much going on. And then I was thinking like when she was talking about data centers, I was thinking of all the CO2 emissions from bombing Gaza or bombing like Iran or what are we bombing today? So you know, like there is a continuous sense of like that we got too much to resist to, too many things going on, too many resistances. And then I think like that is what sort of suffocates our imagination or our capacity to think beyond that. And there is that famous quote from Mark Fisher that I think like it was taken from Jameson and from Zizek, like, but is it like it's easier to imagine the end of the world and the end of the planet than to imagine the end of capitalism. And that says a lot, because like if you close your eyes and try to think like how we can live without bosses or without capitalism, like it's very hard to create that picture. And then I was referring to, so I'm basically part of an international network of social clinics, which is like primary health collectives or activists in healthcare. That is also the reason why I wasn't here yesterday for the dinner, is because like I went to one of the social clinics that is here in Berlin. And there is like this quote from one of the members, and she was like, we meet online during the year, like we have social clinics like all over Europe, so it's not easy to meet very frequently, but we meet in person once a year. And during one of these meetings, like she was like, I'm really glad to see you all, but if we're still here, that means that all the issues why we start like social critics, why we start activism in healthcare are still there, which is not great. So we do resist, but we're not happy to resist. Like we have to do it, but it feels like a burden, like an accident, like a consequence of the accident. And at some point, like she's like, oh, they don't let us retire. There's always something new. We always need to do something more about it. And I think Angela's words are really powerful in that sense, because they bring us back to that sense of like it's always ongoing. But if I go back to Foucault's quote, the other part I think like it needs to be taken seriously, and is still like resistance comes first, because if power is obliging us to do things we don't want to do in the first place, resistance then must come first, and resistance remains superior to the forces of the process. So it's power that is reactive, and this is the idea that I try to develop in my book, which is called The Primacy of Resistance. And the idea is that if we turn upside down this model where resistance is just an opposition, is just a reaction against power, what we see is that we can understand power as an opposition to resistance, power as an opposition to a different way of living, and that can help us. And I was thinking that it's like almost like a baroque. Yesterday we were talking about this proliferation and expansion. Other ways of thinking of resistance, because like if we reduce resistance to the simple act of reacting or the simple act of a response, then we also limit our imagination and our capacity to think like of resistance differently, but also of thinking of other ways of doing things differently. So reducing resistance to a reactive event cancels the possibility of thinking resistance as expansion, as proliferation, creation, openings, and becomings. And I think like to some extent that's like in line with what Caroline yesterday was talking about when she was talking about like happy endings. But then I was also like a bit skeptical about that. Like I like the happy endings, I like the wins, and I think like imagine if we win. Like it was a really powerful quote from another comrade of our union. But I think like if I'm honest, when she was describing like those wins, they felt small to me. I wanted a bigger wins. I wanted like an imagination that went beyond that, which is probably like not something that I can provide. But I was thinking like, for instance, like on the data centers, like it was like an example that came to my mind. It was like, yeah, they blocked the data centers there, and probably they're gonna build it in Mexico. Oh, is that a win? But it's something, and then I'm like, I'm overcritical of this, like, and I'm very performative of this, but also like there are two things, like both like of me criticizing that, like for not being effective enough or not transformative enough. It comes from this very performative habit we have to judge things in terms of victories, like effective things, like she was talking like we need to demonstrate the impact of social transformation. Maybe we don't. I think like when she said at the beginning, like, that we think that our critique to her book was that we overstating the aim and thinking that like reading novels was enough to create resistance. Well, maybe it is. Maybe we can think that like, everything can be like in that direction. Anyway, like that link to Foucault and La Boétie comes from a lecture that Foucault delivered in '78 that is like what is critique, where he says like critique is the art of voluntary insubordination or reflective indocility. In the French, and is the l'inservitude volontaire, which is the exact reversal of what de La Boétie was talking about. There was no reference to La Boétie. It's almost like that in France is a given. You don't need to mention him, but the link was there. And what was interesting, especially because, like as I said at the beginning, we always think of Foucault with the panopticon, like we're obsessed with the panopticon. in the Q&A after the conference, is asked like, so what are you talking about here? Like, you're talking about like a sort of originary freedom with no power, where is this kind of state of nature, which is like what we sort of found in we proposing to find in La-Boétie. And he says like, well, no, I wasn't talking about that, but I'm not excluding it. So it leaves the door open for something like a word without resistance, in a way. And that's what we'd be trying to manifest by finishing the presentation. And yeah, I tried to cut off the head of the Leviathan and replace it with more people. And so instead of having like a multitude, just like in the body, we have a multitude also in the head. And I refer here like to it's not even like a book. I think like he wrote just the introduction and then he committed suicide. But Mark Fisher has got this very powerful part that I find really similar to the ideas that I developed in my book. I found this after I wrote my book. But he says like this kind of, it discusses like this left melancholy, like this sadness we have, that like almost this inevitability of capitalism, the inevitability that of climate change, that we cannot stop the climate catastrophe. And it says like, even in his lecture, it talks a lot about like, how do we get rid of that? Now it's like, individually, he didn't manage to get rid of that, like, and that melancholy probably like is what led him to take his own life. But what he wrote, I think, like, it was really powerful. It's like the last 40 years have been about the exorcising of the specter of a world which could be free. Adopting the perspective of such a world allows us to reverse the emphasis of much recent left-wing struggle. Instead of seeking to overcome capital, we should focus on what capital must always obstruct. It's the collective capacity to produce, care, and enjoy. I think like in La-Boétie, that is the natural companionship, the natural comradeship. It's this collective capacity for living together in solidarity and mutual aid. We on the left have had it wrong for a while. It's not that we are anti-capitalist. Is that capitalism, with all its visor cops, its tear gas, and all the theological niceties of its economics, is set up to block the emergence of this red plenty. Like, and the red plenty is like this idea of like living together with like plenty, like is the opposite of the economic idea of scarcity, basically. And I found this like really, really powerful. There was like a. Yesterday, while walking, I found this poster that I didn't take a photo of. And then this morning, I went to try to find it, and I couldn't find it, obviously. But it was Antifa in the offensive. And it's like a demo. It was like a call for a demo, and it's like an anti-fascist, but an offensive. And I thought like it was like where we're building these two aspects, or these two perspectives, in a way. Because like this anti-fascist, which is now it's become like really prominent, also because like it's been taken up by Trump and by others, like that sees like as the big enemy. And anti-fascism is also a necessity, but it's an unwanted necessity. You know, like yeah, I don't want to fight fascists. I don't want fascists to exist. Like there is more to it. I remember like the words of an autonomous Marxist in Italy. There was like, well, technically I'm not really an anti-fascist. Like I'm a communist. Like I happen to be an anti-fascist as a contingency, but my idea is different. Like my idea is like wider than that. But in anti-fascist in the offensive, it sounded like it's almost putting the anti on the side, and it says like, oh, we actually like we're gonna do something. Like we're not gonna just be reactive and response to the fascists. And I think like that sort of encapsulates like this this manifesting a ghost of, and it says like Fisher was talking about the specter of a world which could be free. But with La-Boétie, we see that like this world was free, and could be free, but also will be free, which is like a happy ending, but a lot happier, which I think like is a good way to conclude the speech. Thank you.